This tape concerns my ongoing and very serious dispute with United Healthcare over the malicious activities towards me by the Navos Correctional Facility. I used to have a button that read, "I'm not deaf, I'm ignoring you." A joke like that is born from experience and has about it a hint of despair. Nevertheless, it tends to elicit laughs. I've often said that Seattle is the place where one goes to learn to talk to oneself. It's a similar kind of jest, born in despair. The honky tonks, who are devoid of brotherly love and have long targeted me, realize that deaf people are underserved, and this suits them in a case like mine. Because with underservice, there's no one to run into the streets over a geofluid, especially since a habit of mind of servility for alms and handouts makes you less impressed by the indignation of a dissenter. So, long trapped, I sometimes engage in fulcrumtronic broadband guerrilla theater, which is to say, I communicate to myself. You see, when you're deaf and can't hear your voice, you're in a struggle with what are known as prosodic features, which is pitch, intonation, the various things that have more to do with the sound of words, the inflections, than what they say or what they mean. People in music don't like words to be used for what they mean. They prefer to load them with accents and intonation, especially if they're insufferably British, bringing down derision through the mobilization of infatuated people. As it turns out, my antagonists are exactly that. So when the IPCC, which stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released its sixth assessment of the third working group, I turned to Chapter 5, which contained information about nutrition and wellness, and was pleased to see that it is an adventure in energy. It's exciting. It's not gloomy. It even begins with definitions of types of human happiness and how they affect quality of life. Hatefulness knows no boundaries, it knows no class distinctions. It's clearly part of the misery index that transcends gross national product. Accordingly, it was refreshing to see a meaningful understanding of happiness being evaluated. Now, people understand that I'm recently afflicted with Parkinson's, and they worry about me. They've heard rumors about what I say being controversial. I'm careful to speak exclusively around children. Excuse me, I mean adults. Why do I make such a jest? Doesn't it seem rude? Well, it's generational therapy. I'm old like Trumpy Tune, who, given his measure of attention span due to content being very limited, I consider him an unimportant person. Yet it's weird how in your face he is, along with his brutal gyrationists. Accordingly, I'm careful to speak only among children, excuse me, I mean adults. Now, what I say is essentially that the IPCC put out its sixth assessment of the third working group, and it's brilliant. The fifth chapter addresses, without going into the rhetoric about it, precisely why Martin Luther King's approach to the world is superior and more sustainable than the gross national product approach. It looks across the threshold of do I or don't I at what happens if we don't. People think I grind an axe about the past. That's not particularly savvy. I don't know that much about the past, except my own experience. I was cut off from school and spent most of my life as a dishwasher. I'm fascinated by the past, of course, and wish I wasn't so old so I had more time for history studies. And I can't say that I blame anyone for believing that any particular person with limited experience knows the truth about the world. I certainly don't blame anyone for asking me to back up my beliefs with actions. And I certainly think that anybody with any common sense would see the point regarding the pressure that develops in societies afflicted by both conflict that is political and violent and the stresses of climate change. Those are the focal points that most need to be engaged. And the United Nations under Antonio Guterres is doing a brilliant job. The United Nations is to be commended in its sixth assessment of the IPCC, which the third working group came out this morning. They're still working on the full summary report, synthesis report. The summary of the synthesis report also is now available. So are FAO documents concerning biodiversity and soil nutrition in farming. Very important issues. But we're faced with mental health problems and growing despair and fear regarding the accelerating dimensions of gargantuan forces around us, slipping us into points of no return. To find something as refreshing as the fifth chapter of the sixth assessment by the third working group, as though they were pioneers discovering something miraculous, is indeed gold. So I encourage everybody to read that, and I encourage everybody who stands firm on the desire of the public to see beyond the fixing lens of misfocused media into actual facts, to look beyond the awful prosodic features, pitch, accent, volume control, pertaining to a deaf, sometimes absurd theater, Fulcrum broadband unit, muttering to himself in public with intent to be overheard and eavesdropped on. Take a stand against the green scammers of the Seattle beast of falsehood, particularly that noxious correctional facility that banned me from school for 12 years and then poisoned me in the mouth. Navos has nothing to brag about. Seattle have nothing to brag about. They dumped on somebody who was there for one reason and one reason only, because I was promised protection from abuse. What motivated me to be there as a person was to be helpful. And I was helpful. And how did they repay it? With scorn, with slander, with meanness. And even now, they look at every word, hunting, foraging, tunneling, and weaseling for some way to brutalize me again. I'm 62. I have Parkinson's. I'm deaf. Would you please lay off?